Hi, I'm Jerry DeCamp. I'm an art historian, painter, and teacher, and I'm here at the John Natsoulas Gallery interviewing John Natsoulas about the life and work of Clayton Bailey, the famous sculptor. And John's gallery has published the best book on Clayton Bailey, and also John has represented Clayton for a long time. I remember seeing a show, I think maybe '89 or something. He had a one-man show here that was quite spectacular, John. And Clayton just passed away recently. Could you tell us a little bit about your connection with Clayton, how you met him and how all that came to be?
Yeah, what I'd like to say is that Clayton Bailey was probably one of the most important people to go out and promote art, funk art, conceptual art, and ceramic sculpture. In fact, what we're doing today is we're really, really fortunate that Judd Takai, the great filmmaker, is going to give us right now a little taste of Clayton Bailey. And the great art critic and I, Jerry DeCamp, will, on the other side of this, talk a little bit about what you've seen. So the show, the wonderful thing you're going to see right now is Clayton lecturing about this book at the California Conference for the Advancement of Ceramic Art. And it's in a lecture hall, so you have to bear with it, but being as old as it is, it's a quite interesting video. And then at the end, we have something pretty spectacular. There's a little performance raku. So Mr. DeCamp and I will be discussing that on the other side. So just tune in a minute, and we'll be showing that right
now. Before Clayton comes out, he asked me if I would take a picture of you today because on his website, ClaytonBailey.com, he has a studio cam, and every day he takes a picture in the studio of what he's been working on. So he asked me to take a picture of you. This is his day's work. It's kind of dark in here, but everybody get ready to say cheese. Ready? Cheese. Cheese. Thank you. It's really an honor for me to be here to speak about Mr. Bailey. And like I say, he's going to be here live right after the lecture to sign his new book. You'll know him because he'll be standing behind a pile of blue books, like this one right here. Clayton Bailey, Happenings in the Circus of Life, just recently published by John Natsoulas Press, tells about Mr. Bailey, or as some of you may know him, Professor Bailey, who taught for about 40 years before retiring from Cal State Hayward about 5 years ago. In this book, which was partially written by Jerry DeCamp and partially written by Dr. Gladstone, we see a compilation of the 40 years of this artist's work broken down into 5 different chapters. Now, there's some artists who could probably do a story of their life in the 1 chapter, but Mr. Bailey's work is so diverse and falls into several different themes that it has to be broken into chapters. And just let me read to you the names of the chapters. Chapter 1 is From Salt to Nut. Now, this refers to the fact that when Mr. Bailey first started his career in ceramics, he was very interested in salt glazing. And by the way, he grew up in Wisconsin and was a student at the University of Wisconsin. Here's the picture of the book that he's going to be signing right after today's lecture. This is Mr. Bailey's first art project. Now, growing up in Wisconsin was a lot different than growing up nowadays, especially in a state like California. The only art that he knew about was custom cars. And this is his first car, a 1940 Ford Coupe. And the paint on the fenders, the flames, was his first art project. The other aspect of art that Mr. Bailey was aware of as a child was the Mad magazines. And Bill Elder, who made this drawing, probably had the greatest influence on him throughout his life, suggesting the idea of the artist as a mad doctor, and also imprinting in his mind the idea that art should be entertaining and educational and interesting and scientific. All of this shown here in a drawing by Bill Elder that appeared in a Mad magazine when Clayton was about 12 years old. So he went to the University of Wisconsin and he studied ceramics, and like many of you, he went through an early period which he calls the geologic period, in which you try to make ceramic objects that look like they're made out of natural mineral materials, the ripped and torn, the influence of abstract expressionism or maybe of Peter Vogel's early in his career. And the book traces his career through his next period is the biological period, in which he makes these pinch pots that have rhythmic squeezing of the clay that creates a pattern in the pieces that makes you wonder if they might have grown into that shape. Don't look like they're handmade, they look like they could have grown. These are what Bailey calls his squeeze pots. And incidentally, that was an example of a salt glazed piece. Another line of work that appears in Bailey's work from time to time, we call the nose. This is an early nose teapot. And his idea was to anthropomorphize pottery, make a teapot that would pour out of the nostrils, would not only function, but would entertain while it functions. And this teapot happens to have a dipstick. The next period of Mr. Bailey's ceramic sculpture begins in about 1965, when he hears about a Chinese missionary who has a collection of odd teapots, and then he learns that the teapots were actually bedpans. And so this inspired Bailey to make a collection of night pots, to experiment with different heights, put sexual mouths and lips on them that would frustrate you from trying to use them. So these are painted clay night pots from the period of his work in the middle 60s that are illustrated in his book. Also in the later 1960s, while he was still in Wisconsin, he made inflatable sculptures. His idea was that ceramics being so large and heavy and fragile, why not just make a mold off of the ceramics with latex that you could inflate like a balloon, and then you'd ship that to the show, and you could throw the clay back into the barrel and make something else out of it again. So this is an inflated rubber grub. It's interesting where Bailey's ideas would come from. Now, here's an example. These are what he calls his Hell's Angels masks. And he got the idea to do this because as he was teaching as a faculty member at Whitewater State University, driving around his BSA Victor motorcycle, the townspeople thought that there was a Hell's Angel teaching at the university. So he decided to make their worries come true. And so he made a gang of Hell's Angels with rubber masks, life-size ceramic figurative sculpture, but he threw away the clay and saved the rubber. And I'll bet he's sorry today that he didn't fire the clay, because the rubber has all rotted and gone to seed. So Bailey moved to California in 1967. He was at first a part-time instructor here at UC Davis while Bob Arneson was out of town. And then he went to Cal State Hayward for the 27 years after that. But one of his first pieces when he moved to California was this 3-foot tall demented pinhead figurine, which he claims is a portrait of Dr. Gladstone, who he claims is his alter ego that gives him ideas and reasons to brag about his work. And this gets to the rest of the title of chapter 1, From Salt to Nut. So when he arrived in California, he found a group of nut artists, which included Gilhooly and Arneson and Peter Saul and Peter Vandenberg, and lots of people who were having fun with ceramics and who would make up names of other artists and then think of weird things that those other artists did and try to create a fake artist that would be as famous as a real one. And so this was Bailey's creation, Dr. Gladstone. And here he is as a fountain. When you walk up to the fountain, it dribbles. And I think one of the major contributions that Bailey has made to the ceramic field is that he's brought the clay to life. This is a piece from 1969 where a creature lunges up out of a bowl of water and scares the viewer and splashes a little water on the floor. He calls them burping bowls, and they're powered by an aquarium air pump. It makes them move and makes the viewer wait a while for the repeat performance. And here again, this is like a life-size bust where the hair pops up off the head every once in a while. He was living in a storefront in Crockett, and he made a bunch of these figures for the window, and there's a picture of his store window in the book that shows these creatures sitting at the dairy bar. And when the workers would get off work at C&H and walk by, sometimes they would see the hair leap off his head. And then they would waste a lot of time standing around to see if it would have what they thought they saw. This would be the way Bailey would represent himself in a poster. Again, from sometime in the 1960s, promoting 33 demented pinheads with a total height of 33 feet, and so on and so forth. Using things that he learned on television advertising to mislead the public. He's a very dishonest sort of person in the way he presents his work, and you have to be very careful about what he says and what it really is you're looking at. But he got into making a whole series of like carnival circus sideshow displays of Mad Doctor operations. And they're about half life size. And some of those very effects that Marilyn Levine would use to make a leather jacket, he will use to make wrinkly old skin. Peter Saul was his neighbor for a year, and they worked together on this Mad Doctor operation piece, which is about 6 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. About 300 pounds of disgusting Mad Doctor operation. He has really, it seems to have a humanitarian vein as well. And I think this would illustrate, he's concerned about the problems of crime and punishment. And this is a burglar deterrent type of device. The idea is that there's some sort of a monstrous creature in a bowl of water, and you could put this near your front window or near your front door so that anybody that might be thinking about breaking in would walk to some other place that wasn't as threatening. Here's a piece that he calls, I think it's called Creates Life Out of Mud. Again, it's the idea that the mad doctor has walked away from something in the laboratory, and you're seeing this specimen in a bowl that looks like meat with an eyeball, with a little bit of hair. But what you don't realize, when you look at this, is what a master craftsman that he actually is. His ability to build with slabs and make machines. His ability to tool the porcelain as if it was a piece of metal to make an electrical insulator or a clamp. And to create things that look just like decomposing meat, or the scum line when a tray full of water dries out. He's a master craftsman. And this is an item that he makes for the people. He reads in the paper about how people are fighting over babies. So he's made ceramic surrogate babies that you can buy. They never grow up to be teenagers either. He's very fond of making what he calls science machines, which is a kind of a complicated black box that nobody knows how it works. Kind of like his electronic probes that are in the show here. You've got to watch out where you stick those things. Well, in the 1980s, his mad doctor interest went back to the 15th, 16th century and joined with his interest in salt glazing, and he started making the kinds of chemical apparatus that a potter might have made for an alchemist in Leonardo's day. And so this is a still about 3 feet tall. And this is a triple distillation apparatus. This is something that was actually in use in Leonardo's time as a way to separate liquids that had different boiling points. For example, petroleum can be separated into different distillates with a device like this. This would be solar powered, or it might have a bonfire under the base of it. And then he made this machine that some people are ignorant enough to believe in when he tells them that it makes gold. And it actually has gold crystals being formed in the glass section of the machine. But it's an example of what I like to call in his work scientific double talk. True science fiction has to have plausibility. And when it's implausible or unbelievable, then it's science fantasy. And I think Clayton's work probably falls more into the science fiction, that you could possibly believe it.
What kind of glazing do you use?
This is a glaze called tobacco spit. I don't know why they call it that. But these are bottles of snake oil that he's made. Maybe you can find out by reading the book why they call it snake oil. As a child, I didn't mention when I showed you the comic books, but as a child, Clayton was a clerk in a drugstore. One of his jobs was to censor the comic books, and that's how I happened to be be a fan of Mad Magazine, but he also learned about chemistry and drugs, and he's invented a few drugs himself. This is a bottle of unobtainium. And he's one of the few artists who's actually had a mineral named after himself, Claytonium. And also, he has learned to use the clay that he finds in his backyard, which is a red brick clay. He found out if you fire it to cone 16, that it floats and melts. And so he made this demon bottle. This is his invention of a solar-powered coffee cup. You laugh, but it really works. He also invented a few other solar devices. I'll show you a couple of them. This is called the pyroscope, or the pyrograph, because it writes with fire. And what it does is the sun shines into the lens, and it gets focused on a 2x12 plank. And so a line is burnt through the board. And like every day, a new line is burnt. And it's like a record of the sunshine that falls on the machine every day. Pyrograph. I think he's going to probably get some sort of a grant to find out what this information is useful for. This is another medical device that Bailey invented. It's called a magic crystal. I forget what it's called, but the way it works is the sunshine hits that quartz crystal and then shines through the lens into the jug. So it fills up the jug with crystal power. I know there's somebody in this room that could really use that. Bailey is the only artist that I have ever heard of who was nominated for a Nobel Prize in physics. And it was for this backyard museum. This was called the Wonders of the World Museum. He has always been interested in fossils, but he doesn't like to travel. And so he just started a fossil pit in his own backyard. Where he found Bigfoot. And I don't know if you noticed, but you see he's measuring the copulus connectus. There's more about this in the book, by the way. So people came from all over the world to see his backyard museum in the 1970s, and so he finally opened a storefront, Wonders of the World Museum in Port Costa. And this is a picture of the museum lobby. Oh, and this is a scientific preparation which compares the penile bone of the Bigfoot with the penile bone of a human being. And the reason that they gave the scientific name to Bigfoot, they named him Giganticus erectus robustus because of the unbreakable penile bone, triple jointed penile. And again, you know, a lot of you will maybe spend your lives as artists just trying to make pretty things. And one thing you have to appreciate about Bailey is that he makes things that are beyond pretty. And that they're educational. So here's a handmade display from his museum that shows you how you could find a Bigfoot dropping. You can read about that in the book too. And then for the doubters, and I have a feeling some of you are laughing so much, or maybe doubters, we have the fossil testing machine here on the screen, which he uses to verify that all these bones are real. I've actually seen this machine work and show proof. One of the souvenirs that he sold in the museum is this piece here, which is called a land chart. No, that's not funny. The book has a chapter about the Wonders of the World Museum that we just saw some samples from. And it also tells you where Clayton Bailey has hidden some skulls in a public place where you could find them if you knew where to look. And so in his book, he has put maps and clues that tells you where you can go and find the skulls of Homo ceramicus. Well, when he had the Museum of Fossils, he also had the Mad Doctor displays in the museum, and he built this robot as kind of like the manager, the controller in the Mad Doctor laboratory. And he was a collector of toys, and so he made a bunch of robots that were like toys, but bigger. And like this is a lamp, and the robot's arms go up and down to switch the lamp off and on. And it's sort of like one of those boxes where you push the plunger down to explode the dynamite. But it's a robot doing it. Well, you talk about body art. There it is. But I think what he's doing here is he's showing you how he got the idea to make his robot teapots. One arm becomes a handle, the other arm becomes a pouring spout, and you can pull off the head when you want to fill it up. Robot teapot. Brews tea. Just add hot water. He was an artist in residence at the Kohler Company twice. And the second time he was there, he tried to convince them that they should make teapots. And it never caught on. And he also made robots out of some toilet parts. You can recognize a tank top here and some other parts that come out of a men's room urinals. He's done a number of lectures, and one lecture that he gave, I remember, was to the International Sculpture Conference about the role of robots in the artist studio. And this was several years ago when people were worried about what are you going to do when the robots come and take over your job. And so Bailey's answer was, we'll make a robot. And here he is with his robot called On-Off. And On-Off is like a radio-controlled robot that walks around the street and performs and asks for money and tells people to go see the museum. So it actually provides employment for 2 human beings. You make one robot, and of course you're employed making the robot. And then he has to be the robot controller, so he's got a job. And his son then gets inside the robot suit. Meanwhile, everybody thinks that he's invented a walking, talking, 2-legged robot. And he took it on tour and did a rent-a-robot business for several years. And it was a good physical conditioning thing for him. He was about 35 years when he started, and he was only 25 when he got done with it. Then he made a girlfriend robot, Marilyn the robot. And he always claimed that everything that he knew about sculpture he learned by taking apart Studebakers. This was his Studebaker, and I think that's an ostrich robot radio, made with a Studebaker radio. But he would buy parts for jukeboxes, and like this is bubble tubes that go in a jukebox built into a slightly larger than life-size robot with bubble tubes. And he has a neighbor, Bill Concannon, that's a neon artist who makes tubes to go into some of these robots. And when he started making these kind of robots, he realized there was no sense in getting into a costume and impersonating a robot. It was a hard, sweaty job, and it was a lot better deal just to make the robot and sell it. Above, to chase birds out of his garden. A rocket that he flies in his yard. All these pictures are in the book, by the way. And now he's making guns. Here's a guy who's always on the wrong side of the fence. Some kind of eccentric doing something that nobody wants to touch. And so here's a set of dueling pistols with protective goggles. And what he claims is that gun fanaticism is so ingrained in the American mind that there's nothing you can do about it except provide people with guns that they can polish and play with and shoot in their house, but that it won't hurt anybody. So he wants to flood the market with these handmade artist guns that you can have all the enjoyment of a real gun without actually killing anyone. You could put their eye out though. So here he is in his studio recently showing some of the toys that have inspired these, making these life-size robots, and showing some of the fantastic ray guns that he makes that shoot corks. And this happens to be a target designed to shoot a gun at. You shoot a cork into its mouth and it screams. But it's made out of ceramic, so I thought you should see that picture. And this is his work. It's in the show. I think to me, they relate to those medical pieces that we saw earlier. These would be some kinds of probes that they might use in the vet school when they work on a rhinoceros. Yeah, that's it. Oops, wait a minute. Been a number of technical, John referred to the technical contributions that Clayton made to ceramics. Bare hands raku. Geyser bottles. The longest mustache in the room. This is the actual judging of the Port Costa Mustache Festival. A lot of you will go out and you'll have 5 or 10 rings punched into your ears or your nipples or whatever. But that's easy compared to growing a mustache like he has for 30 years without getting it slammed in a door or broken off. And I understand, I've heard from some close friends that he saves every mustache hair that comes out, and he's making a mattress out of it. Here's his patent. The only artist I know of that has a patent for a cup that squirts in your face. And if you buy the book, you'll have the patent and you can actually copy his ideas. You should make one for yourself. He handmade the box and the cups and the, and just as if it was a product you could buy. An interesting incident that I heard about that happened at Cal State Hayward is when the OSHA inspector came to Cal State, Clayton presented him with this white jar that said hazardous liquid and asked him what he should do with this stuff. And then as he handed it to the inspector, he tilted the jar, which had made it squirt into his face. Now here's another example of why I think Clayton is a humanitarian artist. He was asked by the Light Rail Commission of Sacramento to enhance a rail station. And so his idea for enhancing a rail station was to make counterfeit money, tiles out of porcelain that would be embedded in the pavement when the station was made, so that people getting off the train would think there was money laying all over it. It sounds funny, but he had a better idea than that. And the idea was that when people saw the money, they were going to bend down and try to pick it up, and they were going to get exercise. And then after they figured out it was a joke, then they would sit around and watch the next people. And so they would get entertainment. Now you show me some other art that does all of that for you. It's in the book. Here's the station. You'd really feel lucky if you found a bunch of dollar bills laying there. And here's another thing. He got a lot of criticism for this, for a coin-operated electric chair. But if you're pissed off at somebody, and you can just put a quarter in the slot, and pull the handle, and you see him twitch. He applied a lot of genius into building this. It talks to you. It smells like burning hair. And again, I forgot to mention that Clayton Bailey is actually Reverend Bailey, too. Reminded me is because this is a religious piece. This is a life-size suit of armor for the devil. And he calls it Fight Satan. And he got the idea for this by studying homeopathy. Homeopathic medicine gave him the idea. And the idea is, if you give somebody a psychic jolt, if you show them something devious and devilish, your body's going to make antibodies. It's going to protect you against further infestation. It's like getting a vaccination. And so what he did is he filled the fireplace in the belly of the suit of armor with Bibles. Started a little fire. So when you see burning Bibles in there, it gives you such a psychic jolt that your body is able to fend off the invasion by the devil. I think he probably should get another Nobel nomination for that. And he's done that in a coin-operated version too, in ceramic. You put in the coin and the piece screams at you, and you hear screaming a tortured woman, and you hear devilish laughter, and your senses are relieved of the oppression by the dark one. And if you don't believe that stuff, you don't have any problem in the first place. But this is a wishbone. You probably recognize this as a golden wishbone. It's called the bone of contentment. And when Reverend Bailey performs a marriage ceremony, he puts some secret ingredients into this ceramic wishbone, which are locks of hair from the newlyweds. And he performs a marriage ceremony with it, which guarantees, promises a long and happy marriage. What a guy, huh? Not just making teacups, but actually marrying people. And then after they're married, you know, or even before you're married, you can start thinking about the unborn. And you're thinking of all those eggs and all of those sperm that never have a chance for a life. And so Clayton invented the urn for the unconceived. Another Nobel nomination for me. He's got one of himself that's almost full. Been married 40 years. Now, in this picture, this is my last slide, but somewhere in this picture is a picture. One of these is Clayton Bailey. And I want to invite you now, because this is the end of my introduction, I want to invite you to go over to the gallery, to the third floor, where the book signing is, and Clayton's waiting for you there. He's behind the stack of blue books that looks like this. And he'll sign all the books for you.
Okay, I can't let this go unchallenged. Okay, I got a spinning skin head here.
Dude, it's pretty sweet, huh? Brady's a backup, huh?
I can't even film to shoot this. All I got is one.
Well, can we do anything with this stuff later?
Live video? Yeah. To what, still?
Yeah.
You find someone to frame grabber.
Yagi soon, huh?
Huh?
Yagi soon, huh?
They love it too. It's probably not that hot, is it? Is that water hot?
No. I'm sure it isn't.
It looks like John, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So man, that's it.
Yeah.
What's the trend like?
Floating, spinning whistler. I think there's a lesson you learned here.
I have burners that I made. Propane. Yeah. I was doing
What was that?
Right. Have you seen my trailer? No, I haven't. I haven't been over because I don't know. I don't know where it is. It's sweet.
It's pretty funny.
So you've been French, you're getting stuff ready.
Yeah, I just got my last piece of film ready right before that.
Really?
So it'll be dead.
Jeff's
cameras. Jeff Childress. Clayton's a crap.
Maybe you need some gasoline.
Good line.
So what would have temporary?
What happened to that light? You can see my pieces. Some of them are stretched out. They're pretty strong.
This thing's way heavy. Look at that. Look at the bar.
I was doing this shit for my stuff too. No one any different. That was too much.
Fifi bit the dust.
First time I was right there, I was doing it in snow. I like
It's got hook now.
take a look at this. Poor lights. Huh? Brown, what do you think about those lights? Baiting
Lights are
it.
amazing.
It's amazing they're taking it. Are they outdoor? Yeah. That's
So I don't know what you guys thought of that, but it was quite a lot of information to get into the early funk work and to go through these entire publication. And you notice the audience was just cracking up the whole time. So what you saw was something really incredible. It was the history of Clayton Bailey and his life. Now, what was even funnier was he's always talking in the third person. The book is written by Dr. Gladstone. The issue is really exciting. In the whole lecture, he's talking about Mr. Bailey. And you saw the audience laughing, and it was quite hilarious. But what you see is a showman. And what me and Mr. DeCamp, Jerry DeCamp, and I were talking about while you guys were watching that was a little bit about the kind of concept of somebody who is always out on the road promoting the field. This pioneering work, I know that he pretended to sell unobtainium and mustache oil, and you'll notice his mustache was exactly 2 feet long. But what's incredible is he went out and promoted what all these people have been doing, and really, if you think about it, was very important because, I don't know if you know this, but when Clayton Bailey started out with his stories, a lot of people didn't take him seriously. But once you look at the book, Mr. DeCamp, what did you see in there? All this National Enquirer and all these different stories about the press and how they interpret it. I think Thomas Albright, what did you think of Thomas Albright, the great art historian?
Yeah, I
who
thought
wrote for
I
the
liked his
Chronicle?
comment where he said, that if you get too involved with this work, it'll make a fool out of you, which I thought was just terrific. And the one thing I particularly enjoyed reading about was his X-ray machine, where you'd put your hand in and you'd look through the top, and then you'd see this hole had been mysteriously drilled through your hand. And this is a kind of, I think, magical idea that he's got in so much of his work that makes it really, really, truly unusual. I remember seeing that robot show 20 years ago, 21 years ago, whenever, and thinking, this is really bizarre because it isn't even really like most people think of artwork. It's more like fantasy design production universe. It's a whole different thing than we've been brought up to think about art. And one of the things that was shocking in the book to me was how much, in spite of his changes, his stylistic changes from the early ceramics and vessels to the robots and the I love the fact that he got a U.S. patent on his drinking cup that would spurt liquid back into your face while you were drinking. Actually got an actual patent from the patent office. Was he always had this wonderful sense of humor and also this wonderful sense of doing things that were almost unbelievable.
Yeah, you know, I was sitting in my gallery on F Street about 30 years ago, and I had an opening. And what is the worst thing that an art dealer, a gallerist, would hear at an opening? The sound of crashing. Clayton had created these tin shards, and he threw them in the back of the room in the gallery, which had a cement floor much like this one. And I turned red, and I ran to the back of the room, and there's Clayton looking up, pretending to look at the artwork, and not even acknowledging me. I went over to these shards, and I thought, there's no relationship to these shards to the work. 15 minutes later, he's on the front desk with these bags of shards. And it says, scare an artist or an art dealer on the top, and you could buy them. So, you know, he really was into alchemy. You know, a lot of people don't know this, but there's a whole chapter in the book about it. But what's really interesting is he kind of dressed up like he was, you know, coming to your town with these items. So if you can imagine the old medicine men, Clayton would come with snake oil, mustache oil. He even had hope. He had a little bottle of hope. But my favorite was I sold 3 or 4 of these in Chicago at the art fair with Clayton. Clayton came with me. And they were called unobtainium. And you could see that the top had been tied shut. And there was something in there. And we sold these things. It was hilarious. And he had this glaze. He used to call it the tobacco spit glaze. It was really quite beautiful. And it was kind of interesting. You could even buy a little jar of luck if you needed luck. So, you know, turning crystals into gold. I kind of got in trouble because he had a couple fetuses that were made out of porcelain. They're in this book somewhere. And they were
the alien fetus?
The alien fetus.
Uh-huh.
And he had another fetus also, and it was really strange. I'll tell you a quick story. So when I started my gallery 34 and a half years ago, I was where Tower Records was on F Street. It's a big space. And in this space, I had nothing except this huge space and a big window as you walked up. And I had no burglar alarm. So he had this burglar alarm that was ceramic, and it had a weird looking head in it it was a dangerous brain bowl, and it would the brain would come up and make a noise, gurgle, and come down. And that was all I had in the window when I opened, and that was a really important thing for me. But the mad scientist is really interesting because he believed so much in what he did. In the late 60s and the early 70s, he opened the Wonders of the World Museum, which on the Carquinez Straits in Crockett. Then he did in Port Costa, but he lived in Port Costa. Crockett is an interesting place because the C&H sugar plant was there.
Right.
And he had this building there, and the guys would get off work, and it was the weirdest place in the world. Right across the street from the C&H sugar plant were 14 bars.
Wow.
14 bars. I mean, literally, you get out, they're there.
Wow.
And so this guy opens this Wonders of the World Museum, and in the Wonders of the World Museum, Clayton Bailey decides that he was going to have a Bigfoot area. Part of it was a Bigfoot museum. And he made serpents. Jerry, what did you think of the National Choir when him and his students dug up this serpent?
I know.
They
That's
dug up this
amazing.
giant serpent. How did you...
He got national press on this.
I mean, it's huge. If you look
National
at
press.
the bibliography.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Of this?
Pages of bibliography, not just a page or two. Pages and pages of it.
Do you think he was probably one of the best conceptual artists out there at that time, 60s and 70s?
Yeah, I actually call him a performance artist, I think, 20 years before almost anybody else did
Right.
it. And I think it's so fascinating that he was able to do things that were, sort of in the funk tradition, but also things that were so connected with pop culture that he transcends these barriers that usually think of, funk art is this thing that rejects, a lot of societal expectations, and pop culture embraced it. Well, he does it both at the same time, which is fascinating, and he combines it with these performance things where he's creating these, these skeletons on the beach or these skeletons in the woods that are all ceramic and they're unearthed, and he gets enormous press on this. It's absolutely stunning to me.
So not quite like Christo, but what was, I think, really interesting for me was that he'd wear a doctor's outfit and he refers to Mr. Bailey or Dr. Bailey in a different context because Dr. Gladstone was the one you got their certificate from to get the fossil detector.
All right.
I thought it was really interesting. I think my kid was 4. We went to visit him at my house, maybe 5 at his house, Nico and I, and there was a giant Bigfoot dropping. And Nico wanted to know what the hell it was. And then was really interesting, a 5-year-old with a giant head. The head of a Bigfoot was like this big, or the Cyclops. And there's Clayton with a straight face telling my kid, oh yeah, this exists.
The Cyclops head was amazing.
Yeah. But I think the greatest thing about Clayton Bailey, beyond his pure genius, and beyond his love of people, and beyond the performance, was that he spread the word. He got out there, he promoted, and always had a positive attitude about all the artists. He'd always talk about them. We had dinner in Arizona at Forensica, and they were giving John Takai an award. It was really interesting because he also decided at Hayward State for the 30 years he taught there, now Cal State East Bay. The great Jennifer Brazelton is teaching there now. What a tradition he started there. And what was really interesting was this secret ceramic society, which you'll see at the very end of this video, which you saw already, I'm sure. What's just crazy, he did red hot, I'll never forget this, red hot ceramics. And he did penises and vaginas, and he did heads, and he did devils, and he did all these things. And they pull them out of the kiln, and they drop them in a giant tub of water, and it would whistle and spin and spurt and spray the audience. And he would even show fornication between the male and female member in the water. So he was a shock and awe guy, yes. And we were pretty prude. I mean, now, if you look at 2020, we just turn on the TV. It's awful.
Yeah.
And back then it was like, wow. It was
nobody was doing it.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, Clayton did these pinheads that were ejaculating in the 70s, and they're in the book. I mean, just crazy stuff. These half men, half creatures.
Did he ever get in trouble for that stuff, John?
Yeah, some people tried to throw him out of shows and things like that. He just was the merry prankster, he was always playing these jokes. But I think the greatest thing that Clayton did was he was really influenced by assemblage art. And
by what? I'm sorry?
Assemblage art.
Assemblage.
Yeah, assemblage. And the machine age and everything. But he goes back into the early 60s studying with Harvey Littleton at the University of Wisconsin, who was a glass guy, and he worked with glass, and he worked with metal, he worked with clay. But really, in the end, he was this incredible, inventive scientist, artist, who actually made beautiful robots out of junk. He got in trouble, yes, for Marilyn Monroe because there was a key to go to her vagina, and she had breasts that bounced. And I remember selling that piece.
Wow.
But I think the greatest thing was I was at the art fair, I think it was in 92 in Seattle, 1992. And this disheveled guy came, and Clayton had this little publication about how to make a robot. And the guy was intrigued with it, asked me a bunch of questions. And about 20 minutes later, this lady came up from Microsoft, says, oh, Bill Gates wants to buy this, and she writes me a check for the robot. Wow. And it was interesting because we had to fix the stereo and stuff, and then we delivered it. It was really interesting. So
that was a radio robot.
It was a stereo radio
robot.
Yeah.
That was in the book. That was a terrific one.
Yeah, it was terrific. Yeah. And so I had great experiences. I think the greatest experience was going to Chicago to the art fair with Clayton and having a booth for him, and his total disgust with the commercial world. He hated it. He really did. He just wanted to make stuff, and he just wanted to make money. He didn't really, in the end, he loved to educate people, and he loved the idea of playing tricks and educating people and taking the mickey from these people. But in the end, these people he felt that, in fact, when somebody was trying to undercut the prices, which were fairly reasonable at the time, we had this big booth, and I told him, hey, just go and enjoy yourself, go and see Chicago at the museum, because that's the way it works in that world. But I think in the end, I think Clayton did something incredible. He offered a museum. Several years before he died, he reopened the museum in Crockett, and it's just amazing, the stories. And you know what I really like is the collaboration he had between himself and other artists. But what's funny about that museum is he would get his son in this robot outfit. You can kind of see the picture here.
Was that the on-off robot? Is that what
and they'd walk around and try to get people to come to the museum and pay the quarter to come. But I think the greatest thing was when the DeYoung allowed him to do the Bigfoot exhibit. That was pretty fabulous. So it was really wonderful to be involved with somebody, and never knew what he was going to do next. But the interesting thing, if you sat and talked to Clayton, he listened well. He had an incredible patience, and the concept of where we're at with art was really about him promoting what we all were doing constantly, giving lectures, doing workshops, demonstrations, and just getting out there. And he was so unselfish. He was always promoting the field, always pushing, and he was always a mentor. He never rejected anybody who would come out to his house. He never rejected telephone. He always responded to his email. He felt that it was his responsibility as one of the pioneers of this field to really push the idea that this was important, art was important, culture was important, but most of all, I think Clayton Bailey gave us a lot. And I was going to the LA Art Fair in '94, and there was a lot of gun violence happening in South Central. And this is really interesting. This is gun sale, one day only, Saturday, August 20th, 1994, gangster target pistols. Okay, rust-proof ceramic handgun in exchange for money.
All ceramic.
6 models for urban shooting. Okay, now what's really interesting was all the guns were turned and you would shoot yourself with them. So I brought these, and he made this beautiful box with velvet inside. I brought these to the LA Art Fair, and I sold several of them. And he was really offended. He wanted to give them out eventually to everybody in South Central, but he was really offended that he couldn't sell enough of them to make enough to give them away. So I think ultimately he was he really wanted to be more like Warhol. He really wanted to give stuff away. I mean, those silk screens, in Macy's, he was drawing and giving things away. And, Warhol was very generous, like Clayton was very generous. So what do you think the context of how we really look through his career, Mr. DeCamp? How we really look at him as an artist in the context of Christo or Warhol or anybody? He produced a lot.
He's so unique, I think, in that he transversed these different media of all kinds of sculptural things, but went beyond that in terms of performance. And I think that's the thing that's, to me, really exceptional about him. There's a lot of good sculptors and there's a lot of good ceramicists, and but he made it into something else. And I was looking at his car collection, his Studebaker, I think, his Studebaker collection, and then that put it in the context of thinking about his robot collection. His robots are terrific, and they're unbelievable. Did he make all of the robots himself, all of the physically, or did he?
Yeah, there's a great picture in there of all the parts. It was really amazing. He had a rivet gun, but I think what he would do was amazing. He'd find things like an assemblage artist, and he'd put them together. You never know where they came from.
And they, I mean, those robots looked like they were built by a factory made to make robots because they were so beautifully crafted. I mean, his craftsmanship is almost unbelievable. When you saw those robots, you went, are these being made somewhere? Because they have all of these weird, unique characters, but the quality of the work was just so superb. So I think, in my kind of limited understanding of the funk art, modern ceramics movement, I think he's kind of a crossover. I think he transverses both the vessel, which he was doing a lot before he came out here, and then he goes a lot to the object. And these are ceramic objects often that look like metal. And then he goes into a whole bunch of metal objects, but he also introduces a whole lot of the performance aspects. So he's a big figure in terms of integrating a whole bunch of things. Really unusual and really exceptional in the art world, I think.
Yeah, what's interesting is a lot of young artists had nobody to look at. They had nobody. There wasn't a bunch of robots. There was a robot show later on in the late 90s, and they were all influenced by Clayton. In fact, there's a guy who's a kinetic artist. Clayton is a kinetic artist as well, his name is Nemo Gould, and he was influenced by Clayton. And all these guys, there's a bunch of them. So now they're calling them, they have a makers fair, and they're makers. They're not trained artists. Right. Some of them, Nemo is, but a lot of them aren't. And they were all, these young guys, 30s, 40s, and gals are all influenced by Clayton Bailey. When they say, hey, I'm doing this work, they say, oh, I was influenced by Clayton. Now, what's interesting, the difference between Clayton and 90% of them is most of them fabricate their stuff. They're not actually doing the found objects and putting things together.
Yeah, they're making it.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's fascinating because that, of course, the found object goes back to Duchamp, which
Yes.
is really the first of the postmodern movements in the middle of modernism. And Clayton, I mean, he covers an awful lot of territory. So.
Right. Well, Clayton talks a lot about this idea that they weren't really fine craftspeople at the time, and that he had to develop that because they were object makers at the time in the 60s. And so they looked at objects and they made these objects. And the objects weren't made that well, but the potters looked down on them. The craftsmen looked down on them, and that's what set them apart. He accepted funk art, but he wasn't that fond of it. Me, Peter Sells, Patty Warshina, and Clayton, we flew out, the great writer, art historian, who was early on at the Whitney and the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the great writer who ended up being at Berkeley, starting the Berkeley Art Museum. Peter Sells wrote the first publication, 1967, called Funk Art. And what's interesting is that Clayton professes that he accepted the funk, but he went beyond it. And I think that's what you were saying.
Yeah, for sure.
It wasn't this, because funk was a little sloppier, a little funkier. It was a little, but the early work was that way.
Yeah.
But he went into a whole other territory. And the idea that he built 6 different laboratories from scratch is pretty amazing. I like the fact that he did collaborate with the great pop artist Peter Saul. The other funk artist Roy DeForest. He collaborated with them, but mostly I think that Hugh would have to say, after talking to him, he was a great teacher, and he was there to listen, and he was there to teach in a very bizarre way, because he was always playing the devil's advocate, as was Robert Arneson. They always did this.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, what was his relationship with Bob Arneson?
Well, they were very close.
Okay, because I didn't know that. I hadn't.
A couple of times, this is crazy, Bob and I were in Benicia. This is wild. And there was a diner called Mabel's. And Clayton would have a shark painting on a kayak, and he'd go across the Carquinez Straits to the port of Benicia, come in and have lunch with us. He was in great shape. But they had a great relationship, and DeForest and him collaborated. They lived, Roy DeForest and Clayton Bailey lived next to each other for over 30 years in Port Costa, and there were no other houses. They were the only two houses. But Clayton collected a lot of things. Can you close those doors? They collected a lot of things, especially at the concept. There was an old brick factory, ceramic factory in Port Costa, and he would collect stuff and bricks and pots and things, and he'd put things together. And I think Arneson really appreciated Clayton quite a bit. But Arneson wanted to do high art, and Clayton did not eventually go into that area. Didn't get the big New York dealer. Had a San Francisco dealer, had a Davis dealer, had some museum following, but didn't really get to where Arneson and DeForest had gotten, and Thibault and all those people.
And maybe because he did have that draw to robotics and craft and automotive stuff and things that were maybe not as saleable as some of the work that Bob Arneson was doing.
Yeah. Well, also what's interesting is at Hayward State, Cal State Hayward, Mel Ramos taught there.
Right.
And Mel Ramos was a great pop artist, along with Thibault and all those great pop artists, and they were very close. I had Mel Ramos, Roy DeForest, and Clayton Bailey jury a competition for me a long time ago, maybe 30 years ago. And I think there was this unspoken kind of these 25, 30 very well-known artists. They showed up at the same parties, the same events, and the respect was this, that if Clayton had an opening, everybody would show up. So there was a level of respect.
Cool.
Yeah, and I don't think, and I think vice versa, Clayton would show up. So that's something that's missing today, because of the fact that we're connected so much on the internet and television and emails and YouTube channels and all these things, that we don't actually have that in-person thing that they had. They showed up to each other's openings like clockwork to support each other.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah. And I found that being so young at that time, 24 and 25, that Clayton really kicked me in the ass and got me going. Arneson did the same, but Clayton was a little different because you just couldn't go to Clayton's house. It was going to be an hour or two.
Yeah, the pictures are unbelievable. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a world that he creates.
Yeah. So he put in all these bricks, and he created a museum at his house, and he just kept building stuff. And then I thought was really cool, you saw the pictures of the rockets.
Yeah.
And they weren't real, and then he would pretend to light them, and he'd have this big can of gasoline, and he'd say that he blasted it off and all this. And
Flight across the Benicia Strait.
yeah, it was amazing. It was amazing. So a lot of that, I agree with you, was performance art.
Yeah.
He'd always like to get a good group of people together, and I think every year for about 20 years we had the performance raku people come. But in the end, you have to really look closely at the idea that Clayton worked hard all the time. He was so dedicated to making art, and he was dedicated to his students, and he was dedicated to communicating. I think we were really lucky to have a spokesman like that at that time. And then the other thing was, the idea was, there were several times he was telling me about people giving up, wanting to give up. Mm-hmm. And he just couldn't see that he would ever stop his passion. You know, when they said, oh, you retired from Cal State Hayward, so what? He just kept working full time. So I really admired him. A lot of people admired him, and he never forgot a name. Oh, my God. He had an amazing mind.
Oh, wow.
And he was kind of bizarre because what he did was he got one of those marriage licenses. He married my brother.
Oh, yeah. He was a minister in
Yeah.
the Unity something or
Yeah,
other,
one of
right?
those online churches.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
he
yeah.
really thought that he could do just about anything. And he performed.
It's a legal minister's license.
Yeah, he performed a lot of rituals too, not just, I'll never forget the first time I thought I got in trouble. He did a lecture early on, and he had a woman who he was revealing himself to. You couldn't see it on stage. And he said, oh, how did that slide get in there? And I wasn't paying attention. And I thought, I had my head turned. And I thought he showed some pornography or something. I was going to get in trouble.
Oh my God.
And he got me. He was really like that. Always. He was exposing himself, but you couldn't see the slide.
Of course,
to this
right.
woman, and she was jumping in this maid's outfit. There was just a continuous barrage of humor and fun, but he did this stoically, and he did it with a straight face, and you never knew ever that it was, in fact, that he was serious or not. It was very difficult.
Yeah, he's a fascinating
Yeah.
character.
So how do you feel about the idea that some of these things were to get a response? A lot of things to get a
Well,
response.
I think that's why he did, and I think
Yeah.
that's the essence of performance art, is that you do something that makes people think about either why you're doing it or what it means or what is this thing. And I think that's fascinating because in a way that's what we do as artists. We try to make something that gets a response. And what's very interesting about his work is that he carries it on, so it's not just the object, but it's the whole world that he creates is trying to get the response. And the museums that he creates, and these Chaolithic monuments and Chaolithic remains that he digs up, and the dinosaur eggs that he planted around.
Or the woman being attacked by the giant bugs.
The bugs, yeah. The California woman being attacked by giant ceramic bugs. I mean, it's just one thing after another. And I think it's fascinating because it is all kind of tongue-in-cheek. But on the other hand, it's also this, in a way, sort of a comment on publicity and advertising. And I think that's quite marvelous because, of course, Warhol did this in his own way, but what he's doing is contextually so different because it's not really about advertising. It's really about promoting a fantasy world, which is a fascinating thing to do.
Yeah, I worked for Amnesty International for a while, and I'm against the death penalty, and I'll never forget this. Clayton said to me that there was a group in San Francisco was against the death penalty, and they were going to go ahead and electrocute somebody at San Quentin, right? And so he had made this electric chair that you put a quarter in, and you could fry whoever you want. And you'd get that out of your system, Clayton would say. And he was so blown away that they rented this from him to show the cruelty of the electric chair.
Wow.
And he got all this money. Back then it was a lot of money.
Wow.
And he thought it was the greatest thing.
Wow.
And he said, I never thought anybody would get that piece.
Wow.
They wouldn't get it. So I forgot who it was, the ACLU, some organization against the death penalty rented that.
So they actually used his art as a way to promote.
Yeah,
their
there was a big
viewpoint.
rally. It was on the Golden Gate Bridge, and
Wow.
and they got a generator, and then
Holy
you could
cow.
you would see this thing happen, and
Wow.
then you could so it was just crazy. He just thought it was the greatest thing in the world,
Wow.
and he always was blown away when somebody wanted to do anything with his work, except he was very interesting when the Microsoft contacted us about using that image, the robot that Gates bought, in one of their video casts for their company. He said absolutely not.
Really?
Yeah, he wanted to get paid. He said, well, you don't have my permission.
Sure.
And then, they said, well, we're so-and-so.
Yeah, right.
And Clayton never was really, although there was a lot of high society in San Francisco at that time, he never went along with that. I mean, I was at the opening. It was the for the Northwestern Children's Hospital in Chicago, the benefit. And Clayton was there for the benefit. And they were these they paid $3,000 to come. And he said to me, I don't care how much they paid. They were treating us like, oh, you'd be lucky if we bought a piece from you. And he wouldn't have anything to do with them. And he wanted to be treated with respect. He really wanted respect. And he felt that these people were very disrespectful. And I was so young, you're in your 20s and you think, oh my God. And then, later on I look back at what Clayton taught all of us, how to stick up for yourself, how to be proud, how to promote our field and be engaged with the audience to the point where we are sitting here today in this room with all these people who were our professors at all these universities in California. And they were all influenced by Clayton. They were all influenced by these 5 or 6 people who were pioneers. And I just think all the rejection he got, he talked about it, and that it didn't bother him at all.
Yeah, and I think it's a tribute to the strength of his character, that he was willing to make such dramatic changes as well in his style of working, and keep, as you say, in spite of all the rejection, keep promoting his events and keep promoting these kind of bizarre happenings and these things that are, even today, looking at that, this is pretty out there stuff.
There's no doubt.
A lot of the work that he produced then, I don't know if you could get away with producing it today, because you'd get
right. Well, but he was not doing anything racially provocative.
Right.
But sexually he was.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting is if he had been promoted by a big New York dealer as a conceptual or installation artist, he probably would have hit the big time. And that was the thing with Clayton. I think he overdid everything. And I think that was making up for the fact that he knew and he was afraid, because of the humor and because of the way he presented it, that he was worried they weren't going to take him seriously. And I think that was the only thing that really he was up against. Why? It was a good question he asked me. Why does art have to be so serious, and why does it have to mean X? What if you leave it up to the public? We never knew what side he was on. I never knew that.
And that's one of the things, looking at his work and maybe looking at it vis-a-vis William Wiley, that Wiley always keeps the ambiguity right there in the front. And with Clayton Bailey's stuff, a lot of times he's really obvious what he's doing.
Right.
And so he goes both ways on it, but I think the obvious quality about it, and especially some of the stuff that's more, really edgy, would have probably been a problem for him in New York.
Right. The interesting thing about that comparison between Wiley and Bailey is they were both myth makers. Exactly. Wiley created his own world, Uncle Scam. He created all these different characters. And it's really interesting. So did Clayton. And I just never could get over, like in the lecture you saw, he would always talk about Mr. Bailey, Dr. Bailey as a third person. And he always talked about Dr. Gladstone. So it's a really interesting thing that he also, his delivery as a person was hilarious. So I think we're really fortunate to have such a pioneering spirit and somebody who evoked the concept of allowing us to say what we want to say as artists. And I think we're really lucky. And he always came back to ceramics. He always came back to ceramics. And I think being a teacher of ceramics and being an artist of ceramics and coming from that background really allowed him, as he said, to have a bigger family. It's funny how close he was. I'll never forget, I think it was the 15th year that he came and did the Secret Ceramics Society Performance Raku. He was so tight with those kids. Some of them had graduated for 5 years later, and they were still coming out and doing performance raku with him. And it was dangerous stuff. Things would blow up. So I feel that we owe him a debt of gratitude for getting the word out about ceramics and really pushing other artists besides himself and always being a mentor. And Jerry, as a teacher, I think that's a rare quality.
Yeah, well, he's also in that respect very unusual in that he was such a successful artist and such an important teacher to so many people, but also did this really groundbreaking stuff in a couple of different media. And that's pretty unusual that you can do all four of those things at one time. That's really, really unusual. There's a lot of people who are really important artists, but they're not as good teachers. But he did a lot.
Yeah.
So.
He always said he didn't want to get stuck. You notice he started out using rubber, and
the rubber mold thing.
He tried tin. He tried metal. He did glass. He did everything. His first teacher was the guy who founded the American glass sculpture movement. I mean, he was kind of an amazing sorcerer of magic in his studio. I was always blown away. You walk in, and just stuff everywhere, but very organized. He had all the tools, and he'd always talk about his new tool. Oh, look what I got! I can do this now. So I was always felt good after I left Clayton Bailey, but I knew it was going to take 2 hours. I could literally go next door, visit Roy DeForest for 30 minutes, and be gone. But Clayton, oh my God.
Yeah. His work is like that.
He'd offer you a drink. He'd offer, what a generous, kind man, and he always was there for a lot of people. So I feel really lucky, and I was happy that you're here today. And just for you folks at home, we are going to be doing several series here on our YouTube channel. We are very fortunate. We have now found, we're going through the archives because of the COVID situation. Judd Takai, our filmmaker, and I are going to be doing several series. We've got one coming up on a lot of these of the masters of American ceramics. We have David Gihuli, Marilyn Levine. Very rare footage. You never see footage on Marilyn Levine, the trompe l'oeil master. So we've got about 10 really great shows coming up. We'll see you in a couple weeks. And I want to thank the great art historian, artist, and wonderful human being, the teacher of art, Mr. DeCamp. And I'm hoping that you will. You're going to be leading us with the next one?
I hope to be.
Yeah,
so.
well, I hope so. So I thank everybody for tuning in. And Mr. DeCamp has the last. You have the last word, Mr. DeCamp.
Thank you, John, for sharing your thoughts about Clayton, but also sharing your insights and your personal experiences. And I think that's one of the things that's so important about this is that John has had a lot of interaction with all of the artists that we're going to be talking about, personal interaction and knowing people for years and years and years. And that's really, really valuable and irreplaceable. So, Clayton died June 6th, and we are just so grateful for everything he did. And this is our tribute to Clayton Bailey.